Hello, everybody, and welcome. We've got a great webinar for you today. We're going to be talking about customer engagement tactics to boost loyalty and monetization. My name is Greg Palmer with Finovate. I'm going to be your host, and we've got two excellent panelists joining us today. I'd like to start by just introducing them. Joining us, we have Erin Bankaitis of Industry Solutions at Braze, and then Andrei Dinca, CRM lead at Wise. Erin, would you just say hi really quickly to everybody?
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be here. Again, Erin Bankaitis on the Industry Solutions team here at Braze. Before Braze, I was at JP Chase for about 6 years, so I've always been passionate about fintech, and then taking fintech and financial services along with my experience in customer engagement brings me here today. But it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm so excited to share some knowledge with y'all.
Excellent. Thanks, Erin. And then Andrei, over to you for a quick intro.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I've been at Wise for, well, a little over sort of 3 to 4 months. Before that, I've been in various CRM roles around various different industries, but I think it was always meant to be for me to come into sort of the FinServe industry because I've sort of watched it quite closely for a number of years. And yeah, I'm more than sort of happy to share as much information as I can.
Excellent. Well, thanks again to both of you for joining us. Before we really get going, I want to just mention a couple of things. You're going to hear us at a couple points referencing a customer engagement review, the Braze 2021 customer engagement review. That is available for download at any point here. There's a button on your screen which you can click and you can get that for yourself. Also, we're going to be saving some time for questions at the end of this. So as you go through and listen to everything our panelists have to talk about, if there's any questions that you'd like to ask, you can submit those. We'll try and save about 15 minutes at the end for those types of questions, but you can submit them at any time. Go ahead and submit them when you think of them, and then at the end, we'll go through and pull the ones that we want to answer. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump right in. We're going to be talking again about customer engagement, and let's start with kind of the current industry outlook. Let's talk about first the positive side. What are the pieces that all or most brands are able to do well? Erin, I'll turn it over to you to answer that one first.
Yeah, so Corey, I'd love to start off on a positive note. And I think about, customer engagement as it relates to financial services, things that are going well, right? And, I think this is sort of the second wave of digital disruption we've seen in this space. It started off in 2007, 2008, and people were becoming a lot more accustomed to using these digital apps and let alone fintech. And there's no catalyst quite like a disruption in the whole industry, right? Or a crisis, for lack of a better term. And so what we're seeing today is the same things happening. People are going onto financial services apps or adopting it more quickly, acquisitions at an all-time high, and so is retention, right? And so these are all really strong tailwinds that financial services companies, especially ones who have put the digital experience first, have really benefited from, right? And so, it's really about, when I think about what's going well, it's finally being able to acquire those customers and getting them to use these digital tools. And what's fantastic as well, especially if you look at this most recent wave, is going back from 2007, 2008, it was a lot of the younger customers and the younger demographic who started, adopting these tools. But now we're really seeing it all over the board, from, my parents to even your grandparents, all across the place. And so that is a really positive thing that's happening in the industry right now.
Yeah, certainly it's positive for the industry overall, maybe less so for those of us who are all of a sudden tech support for some of our relatives, and it can be difficult. You can gain an appreciation for how hard it is to coach, those older relatives through some of these processes. But Andrei, same question to you. What do you think, most people and most companies are able to really do well?
To be honest, I think it's to mirrors Erin's answer. I think more and more companies, whether they are new or old, actually put a lot more emphasis on what their customers want. It's less about acquisition, or sort of equally, it's more about retention now, and how do we actually give people what they want. And I think the push that mostly sort of came from the startup world, or the sort of the newcomers, actually goes and impacts the sort of old banks and all sort of financial services, which actually start looking into how they can provide more value to customers, how they can engage with them a lot more, and actually how can they sort of serve them better and not sort of just manage their money, and that's pretty much it. So I think there's a lot more focus on how we can sort of bring value to our customers and how we can retain them for longer, simply because there's so much competition out there that it's key to keep your customers engaged for as long as possible, simply because there's always a competitor that sort of stays there and sort of waits for your customers to go their way.
Yeah, so certainly, I mean, I think that competitive landscape is something which is obviously very much worth discussing. Let's go ahead and actually look at the other side of the coin. You know, we talked about what companies generally do well. Where do you tend to see people struggling? And we'll go in the same order. Erin, I'll give it to you first.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, when I think about some of the challenges that we're facing in the industry, and we mentioned competition, and one thing that's become, and just like Andrei, I've been watching the fintech space, for quite some time. And when you think about, I'll reference 2007, 2008 again, fintechs really started to boom in that they were disrupting every single component of the banking value chain by offering these customer-centric, high-powered experiences, maybe across micro investing or payments or paying a friend or even a fancy debit card or what have you. And now, as a fintech company, it's like in order to scale against these big banks, the singular product innovation doesn't cut it anymore. And so as such, you're seeing many financial services companies adopting all these different products and features in order to capture more time and spend of the customer and, ultimately to have them more retained over time. And so what's happened, you have this like unbundling of a bank and then you have the rebundling of the bank. And so to many customers, these different experiences may not look very different from one another. And so how do you overcome that, right? And so there's that side of it, really differentiating yourself, but then it's also this monetization piece. And I think, as we look forward over the next couple of years or so, fintechs and being able to monetize and capturing more of that wallet is going to be so important, but it's also a challenge, right? And so when, the way that I like to think about it and phrase it is, customers are being sold to all the time. And as a bank, you have to earn your right to sell. And that could be through a debit card, it could be through a credit card. And it really comes to this foundation of trust. And again, we've experienced this tailwind of the acquisition and the retention, and more people are using these tools. But at the end of the day, it's really establishing that trust factor in order to get more of that customer time and spend. And so it is a challenge, especially because a lot of FinServ companies are bundling a lot of these products, and sometimes they do look similar to one another. So it's how do you really differentiate those experiences from different financial services brands?
Excellent. Yeah, a couple of themes that I'm sure we're going to continue to play with as the conversation goes on. But Andrei, same question to you. Where do you tend to see people struggling from your vantage point?
I think it's a lot about understanding your customer, specifically when it comes to having a lot of products that you offer that usually sort of go to different segments of the population. So finding that balance between the vast amount of data that you can get on and how do you leverage that to actually bring value to customers. I think that's a bit of a challenge for quite a lot of companies, particularly those who are quite new to the sort of digital space and have quite a lot of legacy in the sort of high street banks and all that kind of sort of financial services that now have to adapt to a new kind of customer. And I guess following on from that, it's how do you know what to send, when to send, and to whom to send your communications, and how you to best sort of segment your database and make sure that you bring value to as many customers as possible, and ultimately get to that golden globe of one-to-one comms with your customer, which is got people from ages from, I mean, there's financial services that offer products to kids all the way up to, as you guys said, to our grandparents and even further away from that.
Excellent. So we've established some table stakes here. We've got on the one hand, there's a little bit of a tailwind. There's some areas where there are some things that are distinctly working in the advantage of, fintechs and financial institutions. And on the other hand, a couple of potential pitfalls, a couple of places where you need to operate a little bit carefully. Let's go ahead and transition now and dive into some more specific pieces. So Andrei, I'd like to turn it over to you so you can give us some insights into the journey that Wise just went through. And I know there were some pieces around new business challenges that CRM is addressing. Obviously, your role is very CRM focused. And I also am curious, what that organization and its evolution have looked like. Can you talk about that transformation and kind of the journey that you've just been through in a little bit of detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So Wise, which is sort of formerly known as TransferWise for most people, which we'll get to that in a second, has kind of seen a dramatic increase in usage from both sort of customers, as well as obviously having a lot of customers implied having employing a lot more staff. So from a company of a few hundreds, we're now more than 2,500 employees. And out of these, I think we've got about 30 plus product teams, which each take part of various different parts of the product. And with that growth, I think came a lot of street customers. What do we send? Who do we send it to? And all that kind of stuff. So obviously having 30 plus product managers, they all want to get in touch with customers. They all want to understand what makes the customer tick, what do we need to develop. So, and also what kind of products do we need to push to them? What kind of products where do users need more help with? So that's where the sort of shift came from on the marketing side to actually bringing creating a proper CRM team to take care of all the customer comms and put it there when it comes to what do we send to who we send, and have like an actual strategy around how we do these things and how we actually communicate with customers, how we make sure that we're not clashing. We always sort of send the relevant stuff to the relevant people. That's how sort of CRM came about, more or less from a need to actually engage with customers and not overwhelm them with our comms, and obviously sort of looking into how can we retain them for longer and how we can sort of grow from more than just a sort of money transfer business, which we used to be a few years ago, into a more let's say adult product where we offer cards, we offer other kinds of financial services that customers need to know about and also need to know how to navigate. And that's, to sum up very, very briefly, the journey that we've been through, and then why we needed a CRM team and where we're sort of going from here.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's very understandable. And I think a lot of companies that are at that kind of growth mode experience similar challenges in terms of really, if you're not careful, if you don't strategize around how you engage with your customers, there are some real dangers there. And it's so easy to fall into some of those pitfalls and traps and end up alienating the groups that you need to continue to reach out to. One of the pieces that kind of struck me in just listening to the way you were talking there, looking at how you think about marketing, the kind of outreach that you do to customers and keeping track of those sides of things. But one of the pieces that we need to really talk about here as well is looking at marketing as a tech function, and looking at how marketing as a whole has evolved and where you're seeing technology play a really big role, an increasingly big role in marketing functions. Erin, can you talk a little bit about how that all looks from your standpoint and just kind of this evolution or this inclusion, I suppose, of technology as a marketing platform?
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we think about marketing and marketing as a tech function, we traditionally think of marketing sort of being that sole organization that is responsible for it. But as Andrei had mentioned, product is looking to understand what makes these customers tick, and it really just depends on the specific customer that you're looking at, right? And so where technology really plays into it. I guess I'll give you a story as an example. So over Christmas break, I went home, and my mom engages with digital apps and tools just as much as anybody else. And what I noticed was the channel and the time that she was most likely to engage was at 9 o'clock in the morning through email after she's had her first cup of coffee. And she would read through every single promotional email that all the brands that she loves sends to her every single day. And what was so interesting about this is, for me, I respond, I typically respond the best if it's a push notification, maybe like after dinner or at some point in time. And so the point of the story is, understanding, not only what to say to your customer, but when to say it and how to say it, and how that ranges across a whole different type of customer base is really, really important. So the whole idea is going back to the theme of marketing as a tech function. Marketing no longer can sit in silo to be effective. Marketing really needs to be working with the business intelligence team. It needs to be working with product. It needs to be working with engineering. And one thing that I've seen be really successful is, marketing could get some kind of insight that, let's take refer a friend, for example. And this is a strategy that I'm very bullish on and always have been. But let's say that we know that users who are referred by a friend have 8 times higher retention rates than those users who are not. That really becomes more of a product insight as well. It's like, how within the product can we actually promote this type of thing, knowing that these customers have longer LTV, higher LTV, and are retained longer. And so the best companies and marketing functions we see is, it's not only a matter of the technology that's behind it, but it's also how you're working with all these different teams in order to go towards one single direction. And so there's the product side, there's engineering, the business intelligence side is also a huge thing as well. The best marketing teams that I've seen are really taking, they're looking at so much more as opposed to just open rates and click-through rates. And, it's really about how do these campaigns really drive these downstream conversions, whether it be acquisition, retention, or monetization. So it's really a combination of all those things, but having that core underlying technology to make these insights and things happen is obviously imperative.
Yeah, well, and 2 things kind of struck me about the story about your mom. I mean, first of all, I think you would need a cup of coffee if you were going to sit down with your inbox and try and click through every single message straight away first thing in the morning. That's just a good idea on its face. I think the other piece, though, is looking at her habits being very different from yours. There's an element of personalization here that's possible, that we can use technology now to really identify who our customers are or potential customers are, and the way that they want to be engaged, and the way that they, or I guess the most effective way to engage them. And obviously technology plays a really huge role in that. This is something we've seen the fintech community do quite a bit of in the last couple of years, really looking at this personalization aspect and different experiences for different types of people. And I think it's really fascinating. I just want to quickly highlight one piece as well, this idea of being able to refer customers as that being a much more profitable marketing lead, getting that kind of word of mouth referrals. And if you look at it from that standpoint, really everything that a company does is marketing. From that first marketing message, which is explicitly marketing, all the way through the customer journey, the onboarding process, even the day in, day out customer service that somebody receives. These are all really marketing functions, and technology has a really important role to play with all of those. So, Andrei, coming back to you, let's bring this to the world of fintech startups specifically. How is Wise tackling this challenge of bringing tech into the marketing stack?
I think that's a really good question. It sort of fits very well with the kind of functions that we've got internally. Wise has always sort of been tech focused from the very beginning, and I think that's one of the really well. I think the question was not necessarily how we bring sort of technology into market, but how we extend the technology that we have and how we bring new technology in to actually get to the next level and get engaged with our customers and understand them better. Previously, I think there's been loads of tech used on the acquisition side, and all of the sort of acquisition model was based on things like customer satisfaction and SEO and bringing sort of value to customers from the very beginning. But now it's a question of how do we use technology to bring that value to customers all throughout their journey. And one interesting thing that I think we as a company, we're really well placed is that we don't actually have marketing as a completely separate thing from product, and product is very different from analytics and so on. We've got sort of what we call squads, where people from various different teams, if you want to call them that way, actually come together to make sense of to actually solve a customer problem. So you may end up with an analyst, a product person, someone on the marketing side, both on the sort of CRM and acquisition, all working together to solve a customer problem, rather than thinking about marketing as one thing, one function of the business that all just brings people in, and then it's all about the product. So I think having that sort of intertwined approach to how you treat customers and how you actually focus on solving their problems is what technology can bring together. And actually making sense, and sort of going back to my previous point about how do you balance the data that you've got. I think technology can actually help making sense of the data and actually finding the nuggets of information that actually are useful for your customer as well as for you as a company. So that's what we're doing, and we're trying to integrate all of the tech stack that we've got to actually create that sort of single customer view. Because in the end, as you said, it doesn't matter whether it's an email from myself or a customer service call or an ad on Facebook. For customers Wise or any other brand, it's just one brand, and it needs to sort of send a consistent and coherent message all throughout all the channels. And I think that tech, the marketing tech, and not just that, can actually help us solve that problem.
Yeah, really interesting. One piece actually I just want to follow up on really quickly. I think this idea of having marketing people and product people sitting in the same room together. Well, I mean, I suppose virtual room these days, but still being as a part of that conversation side by side, I think is really interesting. Can you talk just a little bit about how that works in practice? We don't need to go into a ton of detail here, but I think it's just a fascinating point, and I'm guessing that some of our viewers would be interested in knowing, just logistically what that looks like, how those meetings tend to run. So if there's, take a minute or two and kind of talk through that, I think that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So it all starts with sort of identifying a customer problem, and that the easiest way to do it is obviously asking them. So there's usually a researcher involved from the very beginning, getting some sort of research done, whether that's a focus group or a survey or anything that sort of, or even interviews. We sit a lot with customers, and we get a lot of customer data directly from them, which we couple obviously with the things that we see in the app. So once we have that picture, then usually a product person sort of has a look through them and identifies the main customer problems. And then that squad is created depending on the kind of problem and the nature of the problem. We create that squad which tries to solve it, whether that's through CRM, through, I don't know, paid social or any other sort of organic social stuff. Or through other areas of the business. These people are actually put together, and then they work on that priority for 3 to 6 months, or obviously depending on how long that project is. And the only way to do this is obviously sort of focusing on that. And then we obviously iterate, sort of start testing a lot on the sort of the first iteration, and try and optimize our product as well as our comms as much as possible. So the kind of meetings that we have are don't imagine we spend sort of hours and hours on Zoom, because Zoom fatigue is actually a thing. Everyone's got quite a set role into what they're doing, and then we sort of come together to actually solve problems rather than talk solution. We're obviously talking solutions, but rather than sort of trying to find solutions. The solutions are usually coming from the customers, and we only try and implement them to the best of our ability and make sure that we actually solve their problems, each through their individual sort of, whether it's a marketing channel or in product or through customer service or other sort of processes that we have internally. So it's more about how we do stuff and how every sort of specialist actually plays their role, rather than how long we spend in meetings. And everyone's now doing their bit, I guess, to sort of focus on that customer problem and solving it.
Excellent. Yeah, I think those are some really good pieces there, and a lot to unpack for people who are looking at establishing some best practices for themselves. But certainly starting with this kind of the customer at the forefront of whatever issue it is, and really looking at what's going to make them happy or what's going to make them make life easier for them, I think is really smart. And then bringing those groups together, those kind of diverse backgrounds together from really ground zero, I think is also really interesting and unique. So definitely worth highlighting. Erin, coming back to you, in a more general sense, what are some critical steps that FinServes should be thinking about making to improve their customer engagement and moving up the scale?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to recap some of the main points I was making in the beginning, when you think about these major growth levers, whether it be acquisition, retention, monetization, obviously, focusing on these core areas, not optimizing for too much at once, but, really boiling down what the customer problem is and then going from there. And, one of my favorite lines I actually recently heard is, if you optimize for everything, you optimize for nothing. So when you look at, your retention rate and, you look at the health of your customer, where are the gaps in that space? And it's really about focusing in on, where that gap is and how can we fix it and how can we bring a lot of groups together in order to solve for this unique customer problem. And so one thing that I see a lot across, many financial services companies is this initial onboarding experience. And in my mind, the best retention strategy really comes down to that first impression and that, initial experience. And when it comes to onboarding, it's a really cumbersome process for, all FinServe companies. And I don't need to tell this audience, why it is. It just is because it's financial services. And there are a lot of things that you have to ask. There are a lot of rules, and it can be overwhelming. But when you think about that alongside of the fact that many financial services companies are offering so many different types of products and services and features, it really becomes important to optimize that experience based on what the customer is looking for. And if you think about finances and, everybody here manages their own finances or their children's finances or your parents' finances. And, many people have very different reasons for engaging with the financial services app. And so what I find to be very effective is just simply asking the customer who comes into your app or website for the first time, why are you here? What are you interested in, learning or doing or saving? And for me, that could look very different from to Andrei. It could look very different with Greg as well. And so for me, maybe my goal is to save for my next vacation, whereas for somebody else, it's to retire. And so, depending on what those answers are, will also dictate what that next, line of messaging should be, right? And so it's really important to optimize for that initial experience, because what I also often see as well is, many people will go through this long onboarding process and they'll be dumped on this unfamiliar page where they could be doing, many different things with your brand, whether it be, auto loans or student loans or, credit card, debit card, what have you. And when customers get overwhelmed, they will drop off, almost, without a doubt. So, getting that initial experience right, I think is so important as it relates to optimizing for that whole customer life cycle down the line.
Absolutely. And I think the fintech industry by and large agrees with you based on the types of innovations that we're seeing coming out, these days. And I just wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit more, on kind of the growth levers and how fintechs can really optimize around those pieces, those areas where there is growth possibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, like I mentioned before, really taking a good amount of time to understand where that major gap is and really focusing on that. That's the first thing. And then, once you've identified that gap, wherever it is across the customer journey, maybe it is that initial onboarding experience. Maybe it's getting customers to develop this habit moment, or maybe it's making more money per customer. That will depend on many, that will be different for many financial services brands. But the one thing I do want to mention, and I'll briefly introduce this concept that our team uses a lot when we advise FinServe and, many other clients in different industries for that matter, is this idea of encouraging what the next best action is. And if you think about it, customers, you and I and everybody, we are very tired of being sold to all the time. It's, there's a promotion for this, here's your next best credit card here, it's overwhelming and very overwhelming. And so the idea is, what are some customer actions that we can encourage customers to do that's not necessarily, hey, you should adopt this product, but maybe it's, refer a friend, or maybe it's connecting to bank accounts during sign up, and identifying what these high value actions are. And once you've done that, it's okay. Like, let's say we know that, going back to my refer a friend example, let's say we know that customers who refer friends, or if I was referred, I have a higher, retention rate and LTV and what have you. So then it becomes, okay, how do we optimize for customers to actually perform these actions? And how can we keep identifying these actions? And so at the end of the day, when you think about the growth levers, what are these associated high value actions that fall under these growth levers? And then when you're thinking about orchestrating marketing campaigns, it's like, how can we actually get customers to perform high value actions to move the needle on these growth levers without it feeling like a pushy experience? And so I guess, to simply answer the question, it's really about optimizing for what actions bring the most value to your business, and then encouraging customers to do more of those actions.
Excellent. There's, again, a lot to unpack there. Before we move on, I just want to quickly remind everybody, we've got about 15 minutes left here before we start getting to Q&A. So if you do have some questions, this would be a good time to start thinking about entering those into the chat. And then we'll come back and answer them at the end. But in the meantime, Andrei, coming back to you, and this idea of marketing functions not being limited to what we traditionally think of as, marketing activity. I know you guys just did a rebrand. You talked about it earlier, going from TransferWise to Wise. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how it's something you're using as a growth lever along the lines of what Erin was just talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said earlier, we used to be called TransferWise, and now we sort of moved to Wise, which for us is more of a natural evolution, because again, a few years ago, we were all sort of making transfers as speedy and affordable as possible. But as the sort of, and as our vision grew, we're now looking at solving international money movement as not just a sort of a transfer from one country to another, but how you spend abroad, how you interact with sort of shops online that are not necessarily in your country, and all that kind of customer problems that people face nowadays. So that's how new products sort of started developing, things like a debit card and all the sort of the multi-currency account, or the borderless account, how our customers know it, and where you can actually manage money in multiple currencies, and then it costs you a lot less to do that than with a traditional bank. So obviously it was not just all about transfers anymore. So we grew this product into a much more complex financial service product. So calling ourselves Wise was just the sort of next natural step to in sort of our evolution, making sure that people know us as more than sort of the money transfer people, and they can solve a lot of their problems through us. And then the idea of this rebrand was executed quite quickly by the team, and then again, there was loads of people from various sides of the business involved. But one interesting way in which we use this as a sort of growth lever was just simply making people aware that we do more than transfers, because we had loads of customers that have been with us for 4 or 5 years that were only using us for their money transfers, but they didn't know we had a product for business. They didn't know we had the card. They didn't know we had the multi-currency account. So we use the Wise rebrand as a way of telling our story, and then telling all our customers how we evolved from a sort of 2 people startup between two Estonians, one in London and one back in Tallinn, all the way to the sort of company that we are now. And using that sort of, it was literally just like a map of the journey that we took. Using that email, we sort of told the story of Wise, and then we got a lot of feedback from customers saying, "Oh, I didn't know about this," or "I'm so glad that you shared all of these with me, because now I'm going to sort of use you for my business account, or use you to sort of pay abroad and all that." kind of stuff. And then on the back of that, I was sort of just telling the story of Wise and sort of personalizing it to each user, because we had quite a few bits of personalization based on sort of the year that they joined. So we tried to sort of integrate them as part of our journey, which is what actually happened. We drove 3 times more card orders than in any previous month in a period of 2 weeks. I'm not going to give you exact numbers, but it's that kind of size that we're talking about. And it's simply by just going out there and sort of telling our customers our story and the sort of things that we stand for and how we can solve their problems. It's as easy as that. It wasn't a sort of hard sell. It's like, here's the card, go get it because we say so. It was more of like, this is where you are, this is what you can do with us, sort of reinforcing the values and the sort of the mission that Wise stands up for. And that sort of resonated really, really well with customers, and we got some really, really good feedback from them. So that's how the rebrand, which is traditionally seen as just a sort of branding exercise, actually had a very substantial background that sort of it spoke to an existing product rather than an ambition, and it also sort of resonated with customers really well. And I think that's where you kind of see that you don't necessarily have to push people to do something. You just need to give them the right reasons to do it, and they will do it.
Yeah, no, again, a lot to unpack there, and a really interesting story, and a way to kind of think about that rebrand as an opportunity outside of obviously the branding exercise. So one piece that we haven't really talked about is A/B testing. We know that A/B testing is good from a marketing strategy standpoint, but now we're at a point where we have the technology to go well beyond that kind of simple A/B test. Erin, I'd like to turn this over to you. Can you talk a little bit about other areas that testing is really valuable and where there's a lot of low-hanging fruit to find?
Yeah, absolutely. And, when it comes to testing, and, I'll speak to this a little bit regarding the customer engagement review, but of the top brands that we see in terms of retention, LTV, number of sessions, like basically all those great metrics you're looking for, the number one thing that these top brands do in this customer engagement review that we conducted was that they experiment and test all the time. And, this is something that really should be embedded in the culture in your business and should be done with essentially everything that you do. And so when you think about sort of the low hanging fruit items, one thing that I like to speak to about a lot as it relates to testing is this idea of value prop. And Andrei, you touched on this briefly in what you were saying last, but when you think about why a customer would use a product or feature in the first place at all, it really kind of depends on the customer, but you also may need to tweak what that value proposition is. And so just to give you an example, and this is something that I thought of myself because I use a lot of these investing platforms and apps, but they also have adopted debit cards and credit cards or what have you. And so you're always trying to get a customer to adopt more of your product. But at the same time, a customer, actually, let me take a step back. So when it comes to a customer, they really only want to hear from their bank if they're saving them pain or they're adding value. And so when you're testing this whole value proposition, I think it's a huge low-hanging fruit in the sense that, how can we actually test and experiment on what the value prop is? So let's take a debit card, for example. It could be, one value prop could be, why don't we just make this your rainy day fund? And the reason that I love this example so much is I currently have 3 credit cards right now. And, I was thinking about getting the Amazon Visa credit card through my Chase account. And with that credit card, I was like, you know what, I'll just get this credit card and I'll just make Amazon purchases on it. Like that was my vision and value prop for this particular credit card. Now, fast forward 5 years later, I have my subscriptions on that credit card, Amazon, Whole Foods, and a plethora of other things. And so my capture of wallet there has expanded tremendously since I originally got the card. So my point is, when it comes to A/B testing, do it often. Don't be afraid of failing because, the best companies will continue to experiment and test, even if there are times when, an experiment may not go so well. That's important information to know. But when it comes to the testing, I think there's a huge opportunity to test what that value prop is for customers and for different customer segments.
Yeah, it's a great story, man. They saw you coming, huh? They worked exactly how they wanted it to on you that time around. And that's absolutely a success story. So yeah, I've seen some questions come through. We've got obviously more time to submit them, but again, go ahead and get your questions in if you have them. We are coming up on the end of our conversation, and I want to turn the attention now to, at the beginning of the call, you heard me mention a customer engagement review that Braze recently completed and released. And again, you can download that right now. That's available to you just by clicking that button. But Erin, I want to just ask a little bit about this report. How do those results reflect what we covered today? And then, what are some of the kind of high-level takeaways from that report?
Yeah, absolutely. So this year, we came out with a report, the Customer Engagement Review, and it's the first of its kind for Braze. And it's basically our first decision maker survey and our first Braze agnostic maturity type of framework. And so we aggregated years worth of data from about 5 billion end users across end users of our entire customer base of over 1,000 brands. And we saw many interesting trends, one of them being that marketing budgets will increase by roughly 60% over this next year. And with customer engagement really being a top priority, which is great. Obviously customer engagement, this is a topic we've been talking a lot about over this past 45 minutes. And so across, 1,000 brands, we're seeing customer engagement being very much a top priority. And another trend that was very interesting is that, even brands that are confident in their strategies and their marketing strategies will struggle to show success in those strategies. And so when I think about that, it really comes down to this idea of metrics and, going back to the growth levers, right? As a marketer, you could be successful in your strategy and you think you are sending the right messages at the right time, but at the end of the day it really comes down to being able to tie these campaigns to how it's actually acquiring more customers, keeping them around longer, and then more money per customer. And so that will be key coming into this next year. And then also, again, more and more brands view customer engagement as critical to business growth. And by business growth, it's really bringing in all these different functions together in order to solve customer problems. And so one of the main takeaways that I think is the most interesting for this group is we looked at, over 1,000 brands and categorized them into different categories based on how well they're performing across many different business mix. And so the top performers we categorize as ACE. And we looked at 12 different areas across both technology and teams. And so like I had mentioned before, our top performers across all of these brands not only experimented the most, but they also have adopted the most channels. And so you'll see in the customer engagement review, there's a section dedicated on financial services. And what's really interesting, if you look in on the channels, it's the brands that not only leverage many different types of channels, but do a excellent and cohesive job at messaging customers both in and out of product. And so in product could be an in-app message, and out of product could be an email or, an email or SMS or what have you. And so brands that combine these things well tend to see really fantastic results. But I would definitely encourage you all to read this report. It's very thorough. It covers many different, industry agnostic topics as well as FinServ in particular. And of course, you can always reach out to me if you have any questions.
Excellent. Yeah, I would second that. I would encourage you to download the report as well. A lot of good information in there, some interesting ideas as well. And we've just kind of really scratched the surface on some of these concepts here on our chat so far today. Before we get to the audience Q&A, Andrei, I just want to come back to you one last time. We've covered a lot of pieces, but I'd like to have you finish by bringing it back to this super high level. Can you give us kind of your closing thoughts on the pieces that we've talked about and just kind of wrap us up before we get to some audience questions?
Sure. I think there's at least 3 key points that I would personally take away from sort of our discussion. One would be that we sort of need to pay a lot more attention on how we engage with customers and how we bring value. Then the second one is obviously on how we use tech to leverage all the sort of knowledge that we have and find that those sort of nuggets of information. And then the third one, which I probably think is probably the most important one, especially for me, if you ask, is the testing bit, which again, we just scratched the surface, but I think testing is key to everything that sort of a CRM or a sort of customer engagement professional should do. I mean, my friends probably hate me for how much I talk about testing, and my wife is definitely fed up with with that. But I guess that's the only way to sort of find out what customers actually want and what do they respond better. You can hear people saying, "Oh, I know exactly what will work or what won't work," but unless you test it, unless you sort of put it in front of your customers and see their reaction, you will never know whether that's a good or a bad thing. You can obviously have sort of hunches of, yeah, that's a good thing or that's a really bad one. But then again, I would try, and then that's the sort of mentality that we've got in our team. Try whatever you want to try, as long as you obviously have a hypothesis and you want to sort of solve a customer problem. If it works, great. If it doesn't, you've got a lot to learn from it, and then you know what not to do the next time, and then sort of go on and test stuff. So I guess if there's one thing to sort of get away from that, is sort of don't send anything out to your customers without at least the sort of tiniest test. It doesn't have to sort of reinvent the wheel. But even if you look for things like subject lines or what's the best that sort of makes the customer tick, you can obviously go all the way to what kind of content works better and all that kind of stuff. But don't send anything out, or don't try to engage with your customer unless you test something out and you learn and then iterate and optimize your future comms. And I think that's how you're going to get to that one-to-one relationship with your customer, where you actually bring, as Erin said earlier, you bring value, and then you tell them that basically things are are okay with their money. Because people, especially on the financial service side, they really need to have like a proper trust relationship with their bank or sort of the financial service provider, and having that conversation with them and engaging them, it's definitely one of the best way forward. And yeah, I guess that sort of sums it up from my perspective.
Yeah, that's great. I think, and we'll, I'm going to just blow right by the idea of doing A/B testing with your spouse or with the people in your, regular life. I can see how that could lead to some fatigue there. But I mean, hey, you never know. You might get to some really useful results. And if you do, please share them with the broader community, Andrei. I think we'll appreciate it. So let's go now to some questions from the audience. Again, you can submit questions right through the platform that you're watching right now. Simply click on the button there and you can submit your questions for Erin or Andrei. First question that comes through, I think this one's for you, Erin, is how do brands successfully measure retention, and what are the metrics for that? Go ahead and give that one a go.
Yeah, so retention is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And the reason that I'm so passionate about it, and we are at Braze, is retention in our perspective is the single most important metric that depicts the health of a customer, or your whole customer base. And, when people think about retention, sometimes, in the most general sense, it's, is my curve declining? Is it plateau, or is it a smiling retention curve? And at the end of the day, you always want to achieve that smiling retention curve, because you're paying less to acquire more customers, you're keeping them around, and then you're bringing them back into the funnel. What I also like to talk about, especially with financial services companies, is there's so many different ways to slice and dice retention. In order to actually get a better and more clear picture of how healthy your customers are, look at retention based on demographic, look at retention based on, acquisition source. Did they start through the app or did they go through the web? Or it could be retention of people who have adopted a suite of products versus those who have not. And that kind of leads back to this whole idea of high value actions, right? So like if we know that those users who refer friends and also have a credit card are, have this much higher retention rates, then that really tells you a really good story, right? And it shows you where to focus in on your efforts. And so I would encourage, as it relates to retention, look at it in many different ways as you can in order to actually diagnose what the real problems are. And then, the last thing about retention is, and I think this is really interesting as it relates to financial services. And the reason why customer engagement excites me so much with financial services is financial services brands have the most frequent number of touch points, arguably against any different industry, ever. So, you have somebody who uses a credit card every day, and maybe they pay their friend every other day, but every year I have to do my taxes and I get paid 2 times a month. And there are just so many different types of touch points. And so when it comes to, engaging with your customer and, understanding, when it comes to those types of touch points, retention, looking at retention on different timeframes is very important, right? Because with some cases like retirement, that I may only look at my retirement portfolio once a year. And so measuring retention on somebody who just uses a retirement portfolio, like that retention timeframe can look much different than somebody who is using a debit or a credit card. And so not only is it important to understand what those use cases are and what the appropriate retention metric is, but also different ways that you can slice and dice it. So whether it be by persona, acquisition source, or what have you. But if there's one thing that I would say as a major takeaway is, in order to really determine what that, the health of your customer, it's important to look at all of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great answer. So, Andrei, next one I think is for you. There's a perception that financial services don't have the chance to freely innovate and do experiments because of regulations and privacy concerns. What can you share around that and around your experience around those two key issues?
Yeah, I think innovation is called innovation for a reason. It's sort of finding your ways around various steps or blockages, and how do you sort of try and solve consumer problems in a way that obviously it's legal and it abides by all the regulations. But I think sometimes this kind of term is taken in a sort of negative way, as in, oh, I can't do this and that because of the regulation, rather than how can I actually make something work, or how can I actually solve a problem within these regulations, or how can I push the regulations to actually fit and sort of help me solve the customer problem. And I'll give you a really interesting example from Wise a few years ago when we opened our office in Singapore. Back then, you couldn't open, and obviously Wise, TransferWise back then didn't have a sort of a branch on the high street. And then the regulations back then in Singapore were that you couldn't open an account, any sort of financial account, without actually seeing the customer. So what we did as a business, we actually flew some people to Singapore and emailed our customers that, hey, in order to open an account with us, you actually need to come and see us. And there were sort of queues for 2 weeks. People obviously not very, very happy about that. But on the back of that, what actually happened, there was a campaign where we actually tried to get people to complain to the Singaporean government. And that's how the regulations were changed. And then we were the first financial service institution that actually was fully online in operating in Singapore, just by generating that sort of customer engagement into actually getting the regulations changed. So I guess that's a really interesting way of how innovation can happen. That's obviously a very sort of physical way of doing it, and actually flying people to Singapore and creating all that fluff. But I guess innovation can come from anything, from testing, from trying things out, from sort of standing for the right things and the right choices for your customer. And then regulations, at least in an ideal world, should sort of serve people rather than sort of obstruct companies from helping people around. So again, trying things out, whether they work, whether they don't, it's key to sort of achieving that innovation, using technology, trying to sort of solve customer problems in a legal and sort of regulatory way. but doesn't mean you're sort of bound to sort of these regulations and nothing sort of to be changed or nothing can be done. So whoever is saying that is just not trying hard enough, I guess. I'm probably going to hang his head, but I guess that's the way sort of innovation works.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating story. That's such a fun idea, and really it just underscores how much is possible and how much of a role we all can play in terms of shaping the regulations and shaping the field of play that we operate within. So I think that's really fun. I had no idea that you guys had done that, but I'm really glad we got a chance to get that story in. So another question from the audience is, I think for you, Erin, what's the one tip you can share with brands today which really increases lifetime value for the fintech industry?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll reference the customer engagement review once again. So, again, the two things that all or most of these brands do the best are the experimentation part of it and then the channel side of it. And so just to dive a little bit deeper into that, from a channels perspective, what we often find are customers who use a single customer engagement platform to message your customers in an omni-channel way. And just to, put some light on that, especially with these larger legacy banks, oftentimes we see, one group having, owning email, and then another group owning mobile, and then even another group owning in-app messages within mobile. And so with that when that's happening, customers will get maybe an email, even though they had just gotten a push notification after they have done some kind of action within the app. And that just brings a broken experience, if you will. So, with the channel perspective, it's really not only leveraging omni-channel, but also doing it in a way that's succinct with these other channels. And then from the testing and experimentation side, I know we've talked a lot about this, but it's testing multiple variants, it's testing different value props, it's doing it often. And, the one other thing I'd like to add to this as well is this element of personalization. And obviously, I know personalization is a major buzzword, not only in FinServe, but across many different industries. And, when I think about, what the best brands are doing today, it's really taking personalization one step further. And it's not just, putting somebody's name in a subject line or in the body of an email, but it's personalization based on contextual triggers that are happening in real life. And so for me, and finances are a very personal thing. And, as let's say I have a bank and I go in and change my address in my account or what have you. That kind of action should be a trigger, like, oh, hey, maybe Erin moved from New York City to Chicago, which I did. And so, for my bank, and I, my bank is actually I actually have a couple financial institutions, but my primary one is they didn't message me when I actually made that action. And so it's really interesting in that, when you think about what the best brands do, it's really being there for your customer during these life events. And to me, that is what true personalization really is.
Yeah, I think there's the old, urban legend maybe going around that Facebook knows if you're going to break up with your significant other before you do, based on the data that they can collect there. And I think we look at what's possible now from a financial services standpoint, and your bank knows, they have the ability to know what you're likely to do. And I think when this works really well, it can be really positive, right? It can be something which can be a relief. When you get that targeted offer that's in the right, when you're in the right frame of mind, when it all lines up well, it can be really effective and really good at creating this perception that my bank really knows me. When it doesn't go well, when it's slightly off, it can really be difficult to overcome. And so I think back to when my wife and I bought our house. We obviously were popping up on a variety of marketing lists and things like that. But then when we got the offer from Home Depot saying, you're likely to need to make some home repairs. People who buy homes, we know they typically have to go and do some pieces here. And that was one of those examples of an offer that was really targeted, really relevant in that moment, and really appreciated. And we did, in fact, end up using it, bought the paint and everything. And I won't, go into too much detail about how all the projects came out. I'm not handy by nature, but hey, we got there. But from a marketing standpoint, at the very least, it was really positive. So, and again, it's that kind of personal, that understanding who I was as a customer that allowed that to be really successful. Well, that is the time that we have here today. I certainly hope that you have found this discussion enlightening and engaging. Again, you can check out that report that we've been talking about. You can download that right now. If you have tuned into this late, you will have another opportunity to watch it. We will be making this available on demand as well. You'll get a link in the email that you use to register. We'll also be posting this on our blog a little bit later on too. So a couple of different ways that you can engage with this and rewatch the conversation if you would like to. I'd like to thank again our panelists, Andrei and Erin. My name is Ben Gregg. It's been our pleasure hosting you, and thanks again for joining us.